The rain did not fall that night, it attacked. Sheets of water poured from the sky with a force that made the very earth tremble. The grand lawns of the Whitmore estate, usually manicured and glowing like velvet under the lights, had turned into rivers of mud. The mansion itself loomed like a giant in the storm, its tall cream-colored walls glowing faintly in the flashes of lightning. To the outside world, it was a symbol of wealth, privilege, and untouchable luxury. But on this night, under the shadow of an ancient oak tree, that illusion shattered. Two fragile figures sat slumped together in the mud, their frail bodies drenched, their breath shallow. An elderly man and woman, weathered by years and broken by the merciless storm, clung to each other as though holding on to the last thread of life itself. Their clothes, soaked through and plastered against their trembling skin, told the story of wandering far too long. Their hair hung heavy with rain, their faces pale, their eyes closed as if surrendering to exhaustion. Beside them lay an old suitcase, its lock broken, its contents scattered across the wet ground. A black and white photograph floated in the puddle, showing the same couple in their youth, smiling with dreams so far removed from this moment of despair. A bundle of faded letters, edges curled from years of being read and reread, now blurred as the ink bled into nothingness. And a thin, threadbare blanket, once a shield of comfort, flapped weakly in the wind, useless against the cold, merciless downpour. It was not just two people in the rain. It was an entire lifetime reduced to a broken suitcase in the mud. And then, headlights cut through the storm. A sleek black sedan rolled up the driveway, its polished frame gleaming even under the pounding rain. The door opened, and out stepped Alexander Whitmore, the millionaire, the man whose name was etched into skyscrapers and bank accounts, the man who had everything. He adjusted his coat against the rain, but then he froze. His polished shoes splashed into the puddle, his heart jolting as his eyes fell on the sight before him. Two strangers collapsed on the ground, two lives washed away by the storm, lying helplessly at the gates of his fortune. For the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore felt something wealth could not buy: shock. For a man like Alexander Whitmore, life was about control. Control of his empire, control of his image, control of every deal he touched. He was used to walking into boardrooms where silence fell at his presence. Used to standing on gala stages while cameras flashed. Used to moving through life as though the world bent to his will. But in this moment, standing on his own driveway, his expensive shoes sinking into the muddy water, Alexander felt none of that control. He felt powerless. The scene before him stripped away his armor. The old man's hand twitched faintly in the mud, his breathing shallow, lips trembling with cold. His face, streaked with dirt and rain, bore the weight of years of struggle, lines carved not just by age but by hardship. Beside him, the woman leaned into his shoulder, her frail body limp, her lips parted as if whispering a silent prayer. Their hands were still interlocked, stubbornly refusing to let go, even as their strength drained into the earth beneath them. Alexander's heart pounded. For years he had learned to bury compassion beneath ambition. He had convinced himself that wealth was the shield against pain, that money meant safety, that those who suffered did so because they hadn't worked hard enough. But here, standing in the storm, those beliefs cracked. He noticed the suitcase again, its soaked contents scattered like whispers of another life. The photograph of their youth stared back at him through the rain. Two young souls full of laughter and dreams, a mirror of a beginning that had once held promise. The letters, though smudged, still carried the shape of words once written with love. He imagined them writing by candlelight, sharing their hearts on paper when life was simpler. And now, those very memories were dissolving in the mud, disappearing as if they had never mattered. Something inside Alexander twisted violently. He thought of his own past, the hunger that gnawed at him when he was a boy, the nights when his mother worked until dawn, the day his father collapsed on the kitchen floor from exhaustion. He had clawed his way out of poverty, building walls of money so high that he thought he would never have to look back. But looking at the couple now, drenched and broken, he saw what his parents might have become. If fate had tilted a little differently. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the driveway in a sudden burst of white. For a second, the mansion behind him looked like a cruel joke, its glowing windows mocking the two souls at its gate. His empire, his millions, his name carved in stone. What did it matter if life could still reduce people to this? Alexander's throat tightened. He felt an ache he hadn't known in years, a raw, unfiltered empathy that pierced through the steel walls he had built around his heart. His instincts told him to call someone, to delegate this problem like he did every crisis. But another voice rose inside him, a voice he hadn't heard since he was young. Do something yourself. The rain drummed louder, echoing like a demand. He crouched, his expensive suit soaking through instantly, mud splattering on his polished trousers. He didn't care. His voice trembled as he leaned close. "Cert, ma'am." "Can you hear me?" The man stirred weakly, his eyelids fluttering open just enough to reveal eyes clouded with exhaustion and pain. The woman's grip on his hand tightened as if fearing he would vanish if she let go. Alexander's chest heaved. These weren't nameless strangers anymore. They were human, fragile, clinging to each other against the storm. He shot a glance toward the mansion. His staff, stunned at the sight of their employer kneeling in the mud, rushed to bring blankets, warm drinks, and whatever comfort they could gather in the chaos. The driveway, once a symbol of his power, was now the site of a rescue. As Alexander helped the frail bodies into his arms, he realized something terrifying and beautiful at once. His money had built walls around him, but compassion was tearing them down. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like Alexander Whitmore, the millionaire. He felt like Alexander, the son of a poor family who once knew hunger and fear, and that boy inside him was finally awake again. The rain continued to hammer down, relentless as if the heavens themselves grieved for what lay on the Whitmore estate's front lawn. But amid the storm, Alexander's gaze kept drifting back to one thing. Not the frail bodies he cradled, not the mud soaking his expensive suit, but the battered suitcase lying open in the puddles. At first glance, it was nothing but an old, useless box, its leather cracked, its handle half-torn, its hinges rusted. But the storm had spilled its insides across the earth, and in that mess lay a story more powerful than any business empire, more haunting than any memory Alexander had tried to bury. A photograph caught his eye. It was black and white, the kind taken decades ago, edges frayed with time. In it, a young couple stood together, smiling as though the world was theirs. The man's shoulders were broad, his posture proud, and the woman's eyes glowed with hope. They couldn't have been much older than Alexander was when he made his first million. He felt his breath hitch. The photograph was them, Henry and Martha, in their youth, before the years had carved hardship into their faces. The rain blurred the ink as the image melted into the puddle. Alexander snatched it up with trembling fingers, shielding it with his hand as though protecting a treasure. He stared at their smiles, pure, unguarded, full of promises. How cruel was life, he thought, that a love which had begun in such light had been dragged into such darkness. Scattered nearby was a bundle of letters tied with a thin ribbon that had long lost its color. The storm tore through the knot, spilling the papers across the mud. Alexander picked one up. The ink had faded, words bleeding together, but he could still make out fragments. "My love, I promise one day this struggle will end. We will have a home, a family, a place to rest our heads. I cannot wait to see you smile again." His throat tightened. These weren't business contracts, not deals worth millions. These were the contracts of the heart, written with hope, signed with devotion, sealed with sacrifice. Every letter was a vow, every sentence a testimony of two souls who had fought side by side through life's storms. Next to the letters lay a small, worn blanket. Alexander picked it up and instantly regretted it. The fabric was thin, frayed, soaked through until it weighed like lead. It had once been a shield, he realized. Perhaps it had kept their children warm years ago. Perhaps it had been wrapped around them during winters when the fire ran out. And now in the storm it was nothing more than a symbol of helplessness, a soldier of comfort that could no longer fight. The image tore into Alexander's chest. He was surrounded by wealth, marble floors, golden chandeliers, imported silks, and yet this couple had carried their entire world in a single failing suitcase. While he owned vaults and safes, their treasures fit in the palm of his hand. A photograph, a few letters, a blanket, and suddenly, the question that he had buried for years thundered in his mind. What truly matters? He thought of his own past again. He remembered the cracked walls of his childhood home, the nights when the cupboards were bare, his mother's tired smile as she pretended hunger didn't gnaw at her too. He remembered swearing to himself that he would never live like that again. that he would bury those days beneath riches so deep they'd never see daylight. And yet, here it was, daylight pouring through in the form of an old suitcase lying in the mud, a mirror of what his life might have been had fortune not tilted his way. His chest ached. He looked at Henry and Martha again, their bodies clinging together for warmth. The love letters weren't just stories of the past, they were proof. Proof that even when stripped of everything, love remained. Proof that while money could crumble, memories fought to survive. A part of him resisted the flood of emotion. He had built his empire on logic, on sharpness, on ignoring weakness. But tonight, weakness had a face. Tonight, weakness had hands interlocked in the storm, refusing to let go. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the driveway in a harsh glow. For a brief second, Alexander saw himself, not as the millionaire, not as the empire builder, but as a man. A man who once dreamed, who once loved, who once needed shelter just as desperately as they did now. The suitcase was more than a box of belongings. It was a coffin of forgotten dreams, a shrine of resilience, a mirror of what every human being clings to when stripped bare. Alexander's hands trembled as he gathered the letters, pressing them back into the case with care. He tucked the photograph gently into the fold of the blanket, as though returning a soul to its body. His eyes stung, though whether from rain or tears he did not know. For the first time in decades, Alexander Whitmore understood that money could buy houses but not homes, security but not safety, comfort but not love. The suitcase screamed this truth louder than the storm itself. He rose slowly, carrying the tattered case in his arms like it was something sacred. His staff looked on, wide-eyed, unsure of what had gripped their employer so deeply. But Alexander knew. He wasn't carrying a suitcase. He was carrying the weight of lives that had once dreamed just like his. And the terrifying thought struck him again, harder this time. This could have been my parents. This could have been me. The storm raged louder, but inside Alexander a quieter storm began to break, one that no wealth could ever silence. The storm showed no sign of mercy. Thunder cracked like a warning from the heavens. Lightning painted the estate in furious flashes, and the rain poured harder, soaking Alexander to the bone. Yet he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the fragile couple lying against his chest, their shallow breaths ghosting in the night. Henry's hand twitched weakly, as if trying to hold on to something unseen. Martha's lips trembled. Whispering words Alexander could hardly catch, fragments of names, prayers, perhaps memories slipping through the cracks of her consciousness. For a man whose world revolved around signatures and contracts, Alexander felt something entirely foreign: powerlessness. His empire could crush competitors, silence critics, and dominate markets, but at this moment, it could do nothing to stop the life draining out of two souls on his doorstep. The weight of that truth pressed down harder than the storm itself. "Sir, should I call security? The police?" One of his staff stammered, holding an umbrella that shook with the wind. Alexander turned his head slowly, his glare enough to silence the man instantly. Security? Police? What would they do, arrest poverty? Put hardship in handcuffs? The very suggestion felt absurd, even insulting. "No," Alexander said firmly, his voice low but edged with something his staff had never heard before: desperation. "Call the doctor. Now." The staff scrambled, fumbling with their phones, voices shaky as they tried to relay the urgency over the storm. Alexander looked down at the couple again. The suitcase lay beside him, closed but still dripping with rainwater, as though mourning silently for its owners. He remembered the photograph, the letters, the blanket. They weren't strangers anymore. They weren't nameless wanderers trespassing onto his estate. They were Henry and Martha. They had once laughed, dreamed, built a life brick by brick, only for time and misfortune to tear it apart. His throat tightened. A question echoed inside him. What kind of man am I if I let them die here in front of my own door? He thought of his younger self again, the boy who had once stood in the rain clutching at scraps of food, hoping someone, anyone, would notice his suffering. He had promised that no one would ever pity him again, and yet tonight he saw himself reflected in Henry's trembling hands and Martha's fading breath. This could have been me. This could still be me, he thought, the realization hitting like a blade to the chest. The doctor arrived sooner than expected, drenched but determined. He rushed forward with his bag, kneeling in the mud beside the couple. "We need to move them inside immediately." Without hesitation, Alexander scooped Henry into his arms, the frailty of the old man shocking him. His body felt like paper, thin, fragile, breakable. Martha followed in the arms of the staff. For the first time in decades, the grand doors of the Whitmore mansion opened not for gala guests, not for dignitaries, not for billion-dollar deals, but for two broken souls carrying nothing but memories in a suitcase. The warmth of the marble floors hit like fire compared to the icy storm outside. But even as the doctor worked, checking pulses, administering oxygen, Alexander couldn't shake the sight of their wet clothes dripping onto the polished floor, staining what had always been pristine. Yet for once he didn't care. Let the marble be ruined. Let the walls hear their labored breaths. The mansion was finally serving a purpose greater than pride. Minutes dragged into hours. The storm outside softened, but the storm inside Alexander only grew louder. He paced back and forth, fists clenched, eyes darting from the couple to the suitcase and back again. He wasn't just worried about their survival. He was wrestling with something deeper, something life-changing. The doctor finally stood, pulling off his soaked gloves. "They'll live," he said cautiously. "But they're weak, severely malnourished. They've gone too long without proper care. They need rest, warmth, and most of all, hope. Hope." The word stabbed Alexander like a dagger. Wasn't that the very thing he had abandoned years ago? Replacing it with numbers, power, and control. Hadn't he traded hope for certainty? Dreams for deals? And yet here it was again, raw and desperate, lying on his marble floor in the form of two shivering souls. He looked at Henry and Martha, then at the doctor, then at the suitcase. The choice before him was simple yet terrifying. He could walk away, hand them off to a hospital, write a check big enough to ease his conscience. That's what Alexander Whitmore, the billionaire, would do. But Alexander the man couldn't. He knelt beside Martha, brushing damp hair from her forehead. Her eyes flickered open for a moment, hazy but searching. They landed on him, and a faint, broken smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. 2 words. That was all. Yet they shattered him more completely than any loss he had ever endured. His chest tightened, and he whispered back, though his voice cracked, "You're safe now. I promise." And for the first time in his life, Alexander realized he wasn't making a promise to a boardroom, to investors, or to himself. He was making a promise to humanity. He stood abruptly, his decision made. He turned to his staff, his tone sharper than ever, but this time not with anger, with conviction. "Prepare the guest wing. The best sheets, the warmest blankets, food, water, medicine, everything they need. From this moment forward, they are not outsiders. They are under my care." His staff froze, stunned. The Alexander Whitmore they knew was ruthless, calculated, cold. But tonight, standing in the storm's aftermath, he was something else entirely. The turning point had come. No boardroom could have prepared him for it. No fortune could have bought it. It was born in the rain, carved in mud, sealed in the fragile heartbeat of 2 strangers. And as Alexander looked once more at the battered suitcase, he knew this wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was redemption. Because sometimes saving others is the only way to save yourself. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the Whitmore estate wrapped in an unusual stillness. The grand mansion, often echoing only with the cold tick of clocks and the footsteps of staff, now carried softer sounds, the quiet hum of the heater, the clink of teacups, the faint rustle of blankets being adjusted. Alexander stood at the doorway of the guest wing watching. Henry and Martha lay tucked into the kind of luxury they had likely not seen in years. Warm blankets, clean clothes, the subtle scent of lavender drifting from the pillows. Yet what struck Alexander most was not the comfort of the room, but the fragility of its occupants. Henry's face, though worn with lines of hardship, now looked a little less tense. Martha's hands, which had trembled violently through the night, rested more peacefully at her side. They weren't healed, not by far, but they were alive, breathing, safe. The doctor's words from the night before still echoed in Alexander's mind. They need rest, warmth, and most of all, hope. For so long, Alexander had believed hope to be a weakness. Hope had no numbers, no guarantees, no place in his world of contracts and profits. And yet, as he watched Henry and Martha breathe quietly, hope seemed like the only thing holding them together. "Sir," a maid whispered behind him. They should eat something. Would you like me to bring the food in? Alexander hesitated. Normally, he would have waved the task off. Delegating was his nature, but something within him urged otherwise. No, he said softly. I'll take it. The maid blinked, startled, but nodded. Minutes later, Alexander entered the guest room himself, carrying a tray with bowls of warm soup and freshly baked bread. He placed it carefully on the bedside table, the steam curling in the air. Martha stirred first. Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy yet searching. When they landed on Alexander, her lips parted slightly as though trying to recall where she was. You're safe, Alexander said gently, his voice uncharacteristically soft. This is my home. Rest as long as you need. She blinked at him, and for a moment confusion gave way to a faint, fragile smile. You're the one from last night. Alexander nodded. Yes, and today I'll be the one making sure you eat. He lifted the bowl carefully, scooping a spoonful of soup. He hadn't done something so simple in years. Not since his childhood, when he would help his mother feed his younger brother. The memory made his chest ache. Martha opened her mouth slowly, accepting the spoon. Her eyes welled up with tears at the taste, warmth spreading from her lips down into her chest. She whispered hoarsely, "It's been so long since we've eaten like this." Henry stirred then, coughing weakly, and Alexander was quick to steady him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "Easy," he said. "You're safe. Eat slowly." The old man's eyes met his, and for a second Alexander saw not a stranger but a mirror, a reflection of resilience, of survival. Hours passed. They ate little, but even that small nourishment brought color back to their faces. Martha whispered stories between spoonfuls, how she and Henry had once owned a small bookshop, how they had lost it after years of debts, how the suitcase carried the last fragments of their life. Her voice cracked as she spoke of their children, two, both gone far away, swallowed by distance and silence. Alexander listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't done for years. Normally, his mind raced ahead during conversations, calculating profits, weighing risks. But now every word Martha spoke anchored him to the present. At one point, Henry looked up, his voice hoarse but steady. "Why are you doing this for us?" Alexander froze. It was the question he had been asking himself since last night. Why? Why not just write a check, send them away, let the world deal with them? That would have been the simpler path. But the truth slipped out before he could stop it. "Because once I was like you." The room fell silent. Alexander's throat tightened. He hadn't spoken those words in decades, not even to himself. He explained haltingly at first, then with more weight. The poverty of his childhood, the hunger, the loneliness, the desperate climb out of darkness. He confessed how he had buried those memories under walls of wealth, convincing himself they no longer mattered. But last night, he finished, his voice low. "I saw myself again, in both of you, and I couldn't look away." Martha's hand reached for his, frail but steady. "Then maybe God sent you to us," she whispered. The touch startled Alexander. He wasn't used to affection, not this kind. Boardroom handshakes, polite greetings, yes. But the warmth of a human touch meant to comfort, not to negotiate? That was foreign. And yet he didn't pull away. For the rest of the day, Alexander remained near them. He ensured they were warm, checked their water, listened to their stories. Each detail painted a portrait of lives that had once thrived with love, only to be weathered down by time and hardship. By nightfall, as he stood at the doorway once more, he realized something unsettling. The mansion felt less empty. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was filled with the fragile breaths of Henry and Martha, with the echo of laughter when Martha recounted a memory, with the quiet gratitude in Henry's eyes. And deep inside, Alexander felt a shift. It wasn't just pity driving him anymore. It was connection. It was responsibility. It was family. For the first time in years, Alexander didn't feel like the master of an empire. He felt like a man rediscovering what it meant to care. And as he turned off the lights, leaving Henry and Martha to rest, a thought anchored itself in his mind, unshakable, terrifying, and yet strangely liberating. Maybe saving them isn't just about them. Maybe it's about saving myself too. For several days, Henry and Martha slowly regained their strength under the shelter of the Whitmore estate. Their cheeks carried a faint flush now, their eyes less hollow than before. The mansion, once an echo chamber of cold luxury, had begun to carry new sounds. Martha's quiet humming in the mornings, Henry's gentle laughter when Alexander shared an old childhood story. Alexander was changing too. He found himself spending less time buried in meetings and more time simply sitting with the couple. The distance he had built between himself and the world seemed to shrink with every hour he shared with them. But as life often does, the fragile peace was soon tested. It happened one gray afternoon. Alexander had just returned from a business trip when his butler met him at the door, his face pale. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's Henry." He collapsed in the garden. The words sliced through Alexander like a blade. Without a second thought, he sprinted through the corridors, his polished shoes pounding against the marble floor. When he reached the garden, the sight froze him. Henry lay sprawled on the wet grass, his body trembling, his breath shallow and uneven. Martha knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face, clutching his hand desperately. "Henry, stay with me, please," she cried. Alexander's heart hammered against his chest. For all his wealth, all his power, he felt utterly helpless. "Call the doctor now!" He barked at his staff, his voice sharp with panic. But even as servants scattered, Henry's frail eyes fluttered open, meeting Alexander's. There was pain in them, yes, but also calm. It's all right," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "This body is just tired." "No," Alexander shot back, his throat tightening. "You're not giving up. Not like this." He dropped to his knees in the mud, his expensive suit forgotten, and lifted Henry's head gently into his lap. Martha sobbed beside him, clinging to her husband's arm as if sheer willpower could keep him alive. Minutes felt like hours until the doctor arrived, rushing with equipment and urgent hands. Alexander refused to move away, refusing to let Henry feel alone. He stayed, holding on, watching with fierce determination as the doctor worked. Finally, after what felt like eternity, Henry's breathing steadied. The color in his face returned ever so slightly. Relief crashed over Alexander like a wave, and he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the doctor's words afterward were heavy. "He survived this episode, but his heart is weak. He needs constant care. Without it, he won't last long." The words left Alexander shaken. He stared at Henry and Martha, two lives hanging on a thread. Lives that the world had discarded, that only by chance had landed at his doorstep. He knew then that money alone wasn't enough. Writing a check wouldn't save Henry's heart, and it wouldn't ease the deeper wound, the loneliness of being forgotten by family. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He walked through the vast halls of his mansion, the silence pressing down on him. His mind replayed the doctor's warning, Martha's tears, Henry's fragile grip. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the weight of true responsibility, not to shareholders or investors, but to two human beings who now depended on him. In the quiet, another memory rose, his estranged brother's face, the bitter argument over their parents' inheritance, the cold silence that had stretched for years afterward. He thought of how he had chosen wealth over family, pride over forgiveness. Was this what Henry and Martha's children had done to them? Had history simply repeated itself? The realization struck hard. If he didn't change, he was no different. The next morning, Alexander made a decision. He arranged for Henry and Martha to see the best cardiologist in the state, sparing no expense. But more than that, he made time. He sat with Henry through every test, every appointment. He listened to Martha's worries late into the night, her fears of losing the man she had spent a lifetime with. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Henry's condition worsened, when Alexander's own business began to suffer because of his absence. Associates questioned his judgment. Some even mocked his sentimental distraction. But Alexander no longer cared. One evening, as he sat beside Henry's bed, Henry reached for his hand. "You've done more for us than our own blood ever did," he said, his voice frail but steady. Why burden yourself with two old souls?" Alexander's eyes burned. He squeezed Henry's hand tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "Because family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's who you choose to stand by when no one else will." Tears slipped down Martha's cheeks at those words. She leaned against Alexander, whispering a shaky, "Thank you." And in that moment, Alexander understood. This wasn't charity. It wasn't guilt. It was redemption. He wasn't just saving Henry and Martha. He was saving himself from becoming the very kind of man he despised. The test had come, sharp and merciless. And though his wealth had played a part, it was his humanity that had carried him through. For the first time in his life, Alexander realized that the truest measure of a man's worth wasn't the empire he built, but the lives he touched. And Henry and Martha, frail, forgotten, yet holding on, had touched his in a way he would never forget. Golden sunlight streamed across the Whitmore estate, washing away the gray shadows of the storm that had once brought Henry and Martha to its gates. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress of wealth. It breathed with warmth, laughter, and life. Where once silence reigned, now conversations flowed, stories were told, and fragile hope had blossomed into something stronger. Henry's health had stabilized under constant care, though he remained frail. Martha stayed ever by his side, her presence a quiet anchor. And Alexander, once the untouchable millionaire, had become something no one expected: family. He no longer approached them as guests or as charity cases, but as a son might approach aging parents with patience, tenderness, and an unshakable devotion. He ate meals with them, listened to their stories, and even began inviting his own staff to sit and hear the wisdom the couple carried. But the most important change wasn't in the estate. It was in Alexander himself. For years, his name had been tied to headlines of business conquests, ruthless takeovers, and dazzling fortune. Now people whispered a different story. Alexander Whitmore, the millionaire who opened his doors to the forgotten. One crisp evening, as autumn leaves drifted through the garden, Alexander wheeled Henry outside so he could feel the fresh air. Martha walked beside them, her hand resting on Henry's shoulder. Henry's voice was weak but clear as he looked at the mansion glowing against the sunset. "All this," he said, "and yet you let us in. Why?" Alexander paused, his gaze following the horizon. "Because I realized something I should have known all along," he replied. "Wealth means nothing if it isn't used to lift someone else up. You and Martha, you reminded me that the greatest riches aren't locked in safes. They're here." He placed his hand over his heart. Martha's eyes shimmered with tears. Henry reached for Alexander's hand, squeezing it with what little strength he had. No words were needed. The bond between them was undeniable. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander's transformation spread beyond his home. He began funding shelters, opening programs for the elderly abandoned by their families, and creating spaces where no one would feel forgotten again. Yet for him, it was never about publicity. It was about Henry and Martha, the two souls who had collapsed in the rain and awakened his humanity. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Martha whispered, "You saved us, Alexander. But more than that, you gave us back dignity." Alexander shook his head gently. "No, Martha. You saved me. You reminded me what it means to be human." The fire crackled softly and silence settled. Not heavy this time, but peaceful. In the end, it wasn't money that had left its mark, but kindness. Alexander had built skyscrapers, companies, and empires, but none of them compared to the legacy now written in the lives he touched. As viewers, perhaps the question isn't what Alexander did, but what we would do. If an elderly couple collapsed at our doorstep, would we look away? Or would we kneel in the rain and hold out our hands? Because in the end, compassion is the only empire that lasts.